Patterns, pattern application, and edge. So patterns are known by their edges. We can only see the patterns that we see here by the edges. If you remove the edge, functionally there's no pattern, there's no picture. So we utilize edge to help create the pictures that we see, and we can even distinguish that between positive and negative spaces. So when we do that, we can see the overlap of certain patterns also. So in here we have edges, the surfaces or interference between systems or media. And when we can overlap two different systems or media, we create a third or more dynamic system. We can see this like, think about Central Park in the middle of New York. And at the edge of the park, you have the interaction between the people going between the edge. And that along that edge is more dynamic than, say, the center of either of the separate mediums. So we can try to utilize that concept within our designs to try to bring two different systems or zones. So we'll be talking about zonings. And when we have two zones together, we can move the media or materials between those zones. So edge is a systematic property. It's something that we can design, and it's something that we can create. We can make, as a designer, more edge, or through poor design, less edge. So that's something we have control over. But when we think about edge, we can change the spatial relationships or what the types of edge that we may play with are. So persons, resources, society, these are different types of things that we can utilize in our design. If we can overlap the interaction between the cultural or community with individuals and the resources that we share within that community, if we can make all three balance, where we get them to overlap in the middle, there we can see where we can kind of create life, spirit, or culture. These really dynamic is when there's a fair interaction between community, individuals, and sharing of resources. It's when something's out of balance, if we want to call it, we are the 99%, right? What are they saying is out of balance? There's, hey, well, 1% of the population has 90% of the money. This is non-fair balance. That's what they're describing. But if we have a more socialized or balanced situation. So when we do that, we can start to see where these overlaps are. So like, for instance, where people and resources overlap, right? We can get things like abundance, wealth, knowledge accumulation. Or if we overlap people with society, we can have landscape structures where how people interact in society. We can find resources in society, which is growth, succession, our economy. So when the society, say the people controlling our society, put too much focus on resource accumulation, then that's where we see growth, like the capitalist growth system, or our economy being overshadowing the individual. So what we want to try to do is appreciate that there are these dynamics within our own designs and if we develop communities or we develop community dynamics, and we want to try to balance them, and that's where we're going to find that more holistic aspect where somebody can walk in and say, wow, man, I really feel good. Well, what is the balance that I really feel good? Is my individual needs met? Or the more broader communal needs met? And are the resources tend to be allocated fairly amongst everyone? Or does this person get all this and that person doesn't get this? That's not fair. And these are the type of things that we can see within designs, okay? So for instance, if it's a longer term plan for Raktamachat to develop further than it is today, and I have my own home, I mean, I built it, it's my house, but if people wanted to live here for long term, they were going to be long term residents, spend the rest of their life here. Sleeping in a bungalow forever is not necessarily equitable, right? As such that we can then use natural building to build homes, so a person has a home. The question of what a home needs, we don't need a lot, right? We just need our personal space. But in a short term, we could see the bungalow being acceptable in the short term. So these are things that we're going to see spatial or time scales that change our design over time. This wasn't the classroom when we first built the building. We held our first PDCs in the sala. That's all we had. Once we got the sala good, we built this. But this didn't become the classroom because we were also sleeping in the sala. We had no housing. So we slept in the sala, we cooked in the sala, we lived in the sala, we did class in the sala, and that's how it was. That's all we had. But when we built this building, and we see the chains on the roof, and that's not because we do chain stuff in here. That's why the lights are here, right? No, I mean, that's where we hung the mosquito nets. So we had the mosquito nets, and this was our dorm. So people had a dormitory. And we could stay with just a dormitory, that's fine. Some places get to a dormitory stage and they never develop past that, and that's okay, there's nothing wrong with that. But if you are into natural building and you have skills, passion, things, well, we built the bungalows. And we've now have our bungalows, so we moved to people stay in the bungalows, and now we can have a better classroom. And equally, we're actually starting to build nicer than bungalows. So the that we have once it's finished next year. Wow, that's a really nice bungalow, or maybe a small family comes, they can stay in there. So we can see a successional change. So we want to try to have a balance, understand that it changes with time and growth, but this is something to help keep us in balance. When we look at natural pictures or natural landscapes and we start to see edge, like the edge of a field and a forest, what we notice is that edges tend to be very deep or porous. They typically have three-dimensional forms extending into the edge. It's not linear. So they tend to be more biologically productive than sharp or shallow edges. What happens here is the animal systems, if you will, of each can intervene in that third edge. So for instance, a bird may sit on the edge of the forest overlooking the field. He may swoop in and eat the mouse that was eating the seeds. He comes back, flies into the forest, and disperses the nutrition. This animal moving between. So that represents a third or a more complex zone. The interaction between two zones is a third zone. The most important edge that a lot of people may overlook is actually our soil. Our soil really creates the fertility for the life that we see on these upper edges. So we need to focus on, and we do focus a lot on these upper edges or creating zonal things in permaculture, but we also should not overlook that mineral substrate. Without the mineral cycling, then both plants and animals will die over time. So we have to focus on a three-dimensional view of edge. In order to help us with moving these nutrients, cycling minerals, cycling energy, we can think of translators. So translators facilitate exchanges across system boundaries. So where, if you were doing natural building and you facilitated the exchange of, say, clay, from that system to this one, we facilitated that exchange. So we could see it that way. Pichon, deer, and Hmong today are going to get compost that we use in our gardens each month. And so that's their facilitating the exchange from a boundary, the local village, to bring that resource that they find as a waste. We bring that in, we turn it into an input or feed it to our gardens. But we can look at animals to help us with that also, not just our physical nature, which is easy to see, us moving things, but animals also move things. So bees, horseshoe crabs, things that can do that. Irish people can harvest seaweed and then sell seaweed to people in Britain for organic fertilizer. This is a translator. Permaculture could be seen as the interaction or the overlap between architecture, agriculture, forestry. So where those individual disciplines overlap, could that be the description of permaculture? That more dynamic system than each one individually. So this is where we want to try to do, is make things overlap and we get more than each thing individual. That creates the concept of the marginal area. The marginal is elements that contribute to peripheral systems or functions. So here we can see that maybe we have a garden, and the garden could back up to a little bit more of a wilder area. And inside of that wilder area, we might have bees. The bees could live there, and the beehive would be in that little bit more protected wild zone. But the bee easily can fly over the peripheral to pollinate our garden, right? So this is where we have these species that can move, translators. So if I want to have butterflies, I need to have place for pollen. And if I have my orchard, it's only really fruiting in the rainy season. But here, all the trees around the bungalows are flowering trees. So right now they're young and only maybe 10 or 20% are actually flowering. But in the next 2 to 3 years, every one of those trees is a perennial flower tree. So you walk in there and it's just flowers and butterflies and all of the things. So your pollinators will have a food source year round. So when it is time for our, say, mango harvest, we'll have the pollinators on site to be able to go to facilitate that. We'll get an increased mango yield with less or no work, only by providing the habitat for the facilitators to survive through the dry season. So edges and marginals are areas and they're places of inspiration and heightened experience. So when we go and travel, or we climb to the edge, or we want to overlook the mountain, these are heightened experiences. So we can help to create this heightened experience within our own designs by appreciating the boundary and creating the boundaries between two separate zones so that you can move between this zone and that zone. Creates a different experiential exchange. and that heightens the experience, okay? If I'm in the garden and I transition from the garden into the food forest, that place, that transition level is a heightened experience where I changed from this type of system into that type of system. Today we harvested the ginger. We took the mass from the ginger, we walked and put it into the compost, long-term compost in the food forest, and we crossed that boundary. That compost pile is right there strategically, so next year it'll be very easy to move the compost back to the garden. This is the exchange across that boundary line. So edges create boundary conditions. When we create edges, particles can accumulate. For instance, a fence. If I put up a fence line, birds will come to sit on the fence. They will defecate. Seeds, nutrients will accumulate at the fence line, which will increase the grass growth. We'll get larger tufts of grass. When the rainfall comes, the rain will come and hit that and slow down. The silts will accumulate at the edge, then further increasing the water and nutrient at that edge. So particle accumulation along edges. Unique niches will then occur. Well, this plant or species could basically live at that particular edge, but it would not be able to live in, say, the broader scale. Okay, so we can see that lots of times where we have fence lines with trees that grow up, habitat, birds, but not in the center. Resources of two different systems can become available at an edge. I grew up, Louisiana had horses, still plan to have horses. I don't think my kids are really old enough yet for me to want to deal with that, but I would say in another 3 years for sure, and it is on our master plan, right, master plan, that I'll introduce horses to Raktamachat. I have the place laid out where I would put them. But where would I put their house, their stable? Well, I tend to want to put it at the intersection of a boundary of another area that would be able to use the resource, their manure. So it'd be very easy. The horses would go out, eat the grass, bring it to this. And I think if that was my garden. So I could have it at the end of my garden is the horses into the next, say, zone. The horses bringing the manure. The manure crosses the boundary into my compost. The compost goes into my garden. This is where we start to see these relationships. The horse as a manure gatherer to create my composting system for my garden. So if we have a pond here and we overlap it, or a zone, this intersection is more complex than each of those zones individually. So now we've created, by overlapping two separate zones, a third more complex zone. So most productive and unique ecosystems that we see in the world are where two separate ecosystems overlap or merge together. Estuaries, coral reefs, and wetlands. This is what's happening, where these two zones are meeting, okay? Whether that's mangroves, where we have the land intersecting with the sea, and we see the particle accumulation of nutrients in a mangrove, or these types of situations. So we can look at mapping again, and we're getting more in, starting to drop in a little bit more of the permaculture design aspect that we'll see techniques that we'll use in the design phases. But here I start to map the interactions, and I can start with like the sun. And I have energy coming into my system from the sun, and how that sun can affect the different systems, and then move or translate through. So I start to find out, and this is like a mapping, this is very, very macro. This is not necessarily a master plan, but helping me to understand the larger interactions that I might see driven by the sun field energy on a particular site. From there, I can then start to take each one of those and drill down into more detail and look for more interconnectedness.